Hello, and welcome to the South Coast Artist Index, where artists, performers, and writers, as well as curators, directors, and supporters, anyone with ties to the creative community, drops by to introduce themselves to you. We'll talk about their beginnings, their vision, their passion, and so much more. The South Coast Artist Index podcast is brought to you in part by Heavenly Spirits, who invites you to celebrate the art of life and creative communities everywhere.
Hi, folks. Welcome to another episode of the Artists Index in Focus podcast. And we have, I think, a first. It's been really not difficult, but we haven't had much of a chance to get literary artists in here. And this particular gentleman is a mystery writer, if I'm correct. And with that in mind, I'm going to let him, as per usual, introduce himself and spell his name for the record. Guess?
My name is Stephen D. Rogers. It's Stephen. D is in David. Rogers.
Sounds good. I've had several friends named Stephen with a PH, and at least one of them really used to go ballistic whenever people used to spell Steven.
That was always an issue. I try not to go ballistic. What has crept in recent years is people spelling it the second syllable with an A.
And
people who had known me for decades all of a sudden started misspelling it. But I've never met anyone that actually spelled it that way.
Well, we have someone who spells it that way because his name is Stefan, which I'm sure, and he's out in Detroit, and he's a music producer and entertainment entrepreneur out there. But I'm gonna ask him someday because he's interviewed me, so I'm gonna try to interview him. Has he had people try to undo Stefan to Stephen? So that's the way it goes. So a mystery writer, right?
Yeah.
How did you get in that?
Actually, it's of everything I've published, half of it's mystery, and then half is everything else. So I write across the genres. I have focused more on mystery because I was selling more mystery. So, you followed up with the places you were selling to. And it speaks to me more than some of the other genres. So it's also always a default setting. As soon as a character comes to me, it's typically, a mystery or a crime story.
Okay. Now, do you write under Stephen D. Rogers or a nom de plume?
I use my name. There was a lot of concern originally because I was writing across so many different genres. And that would be tough to do if you were writing novels because people would go out and buy a book expecting a certain experience. But with short stories, they're buying a magazine or an anthology, and the editor has already made the choice of, linking you in with other stories of that genre. So they would only see the mysteries if they're buying mystery anthologies. So they're not going to see the science fiction that is in the science fiction magazines.
Mm-hmm. Now, I'm trying to think of, successful published authors who cross genres and have maintained the same name. And I'm just kind of, Neil Gaiman really hasn't crossed. Well, yeah, he has, because, Art Matters is not exactly one of his, American Gods or the Sandman, kind of novels. But I guess once people like you, they like you, regardless of what you write.
Stephen King, there was straight horror, then there was like science fiction horror, but I think he also wrote a fantasy novel about a dragon. And then he's done more commercial women's fiction. And I think that's a case of the people that like Stephen, they just read whatever he writes.
Yeah, I remember. I think one of my favorite books of his wasn't even a novel. It was a book of short stories. In fact, I
Yeah.
never realized that so many of those short stories entered into Hollywood. One of them being The Duel, which was one scary story
Yeah.
with no real horror elements in it. All you ever saw was this guy, the trucker's hand shifting,
Right.
shifting this semi and his cowboy boots.
The boots, yeah.
And Dennis Weaver was the
Yeah.
victim in his Dodge Dart, was it?
I don't remember the car, but it was Dennis Weaver.
It was one scary movie,
Yeah.
that's for sure. So, did you go to school for this?
No. I was going to go to school for architecture, and my last semester in high school, they brought in computers for the first time and allowed people to take programming courses. And I just loved the idea of programming games. Back then, it was, pick a letter 1 to 3, whether you want to go through the window, through the door, down the alley. It was, all text-based games. But the fact that you could have a randomizer built in, what was going to happen when you got to the other side, I just loved the potential of that power.
Uh-huh.
I've done a lot of coursework and then workshops and conferences and stuff, but it seemed I didn't really see the benefit to me of going for an English degree and then an MFA in creative writing. It seemed too on the nose. So, for example, I would look at how you wrote programs. Back then it was all, punch cards, but it was all about structure and subroutines and functions. And I saw the parallels to writing. So I used learning about that to change how I wrote. It's like when at one point I decided I needed to get better at setting. So my first thought is not, find a course in setting. My first thought is take a class in stained glass, because that makes me think differently, but, parallel, and it feeds it from the side. I don't know.
Well, I mean,
you can say it works for me or it doesn't.
When you first said that you wanted to be an architect, my first pithy response was going to be, oh, well, building stories,
Yeah.
So obviously this building thing is in your head, from the architecture to building games, because it is building a database for those games. And I mean, back in those days, Fortran, COBOL, there was at least a couple more. There was a bit of structure into it. Now, how would you, and then before I go on, as a writer, do you get the same kind of response from people that are painters do? Oh, do you make a living doing that?
Oh yeah, it's very, very funny. People just assume that you've published anything that's all you do for a living. I'm like, no. Another funny response, I had come back from lunch one day and someone asked me how my lunch was. And during lunch, I had, logged into mail and received rejections because, that's the business. And I mentioned, I got like a rejection or two during lunch, and they were just dumbfounded. What do you mean they rejected it? They sort of felt like I had written it, so it was the editor's obligation just to publish it. What right do they have to not publish it? Like, well, that's
what they're
do. Under no obligation, certainly.
Yeah. The arts are a tough business. They are a tough life and a tough lifestyle.
Right.
That's for sure. Now, as far as mysteries are concerned, I guess I used to tell my classes, you have to be conscious of things. And I would give them this example: from now until the next time we meet, I want you to be conscious of red-headed people. That's your assignment. That's your homework. And they'd look at me like, what? And then I could see them, they'd be returning the next class, and I could see their faces, and they're like, they want to spill it. And I'm like, why are you guys all animated? It's like, oh my God. And it's almost the same story. We never realized there were that many redheads in the world. Everywhere I looked, there was a redhead. It's like, so, I mean, for when you're trying to find a mystery, do you try to make yourself conscious? Have your ears perked all the time? Is it something that comes like out of the blue? What stimulates that creative process?
For me, most of the time, I hear this person speaking, and then I want to know more about them and their story, which really ties into that whole being. People are not, for the most part, conscious at all. Even more so these days, because they can always hide in their phone. But I think one of the purposes of art is to slow people down and force them to study something and be conscious of what it is. I don't really consider writing art the way all the other arts are considered. I don't know why. Maybe because I don't consider myself an artist. But one of the things that, in terms of ideas, that is often a creative boost for me is response to art. So, looking at a painting, there's certain paintings in particular that then just make me want to tell the story of that art. And it's the same.
So if you don't have the answer, you make one up, so to speak. In other words, you use it as a launching pad or a starting point. And you never know when it's going to hit you, right?
Right.
Okay, so what's one of the weirdest or different or, gobsmack or whatever the term you want to use, one of those, oh, wow. You had to run to your keyboard almost instantly when you got this. What happened? Do you remember when, where, why, and how?
Unfortunately, it's almost always that way. Although I can't always necessarily run to the keyboard, so you make enough notes that you can deal with it later. Right. I say unfortunately because you can end up generating more things you want to follow up on than you have time to follow up on. So, I'm working on something now that's due at the end of this month, but I keep getting sidetracked by those sparkling things that just, I have to follow up on that. Because I've had the experience, especially if it's late at night and you have something in a sort of dream state, I really have to follow up on it then, because the next day, it's really hard to capture again the mood or tone of it.
Have you ever taken to using a micro recorder and spilling your guts, so to speak, in a moment?
I will brainstorm with a micro recorder. I used my writing group was hour and a half drive. So I would brainstorm, but then it took so long to play back the recorder, it would sort of fall out of favor. There was some dictation software, but depending on the 490, when I drove on 495, it was 50% correct. Route 3, I could get 75% correct. Sorry.
It's a publisher. Just
well, a sales call.
Oh, yeah.
So then I would just more write notes, but I was, or, I would, that whole illusion that I'll remember this. But then when you would listen back to the tape, it's like, oh, I forgot I had that idea and that idea and that idea. So I haven't really found a perfect way to capture that kind of stuff. Just quick notes and hope that I can remember enough of what it was that I can then start transcribing.
Some of those ideas that faded away because you get sidetracked by life and other things.
Yeah.
I always feel if they're really good and strong enough, they'll percolate their way back up into your consciousness again.
Right. And there's also people that will say, if you forgot it, there's a reason for that.
Yeah. And it's funny too, because I mean, I've been working on trying to increase my painting time at the easel. And again, we have a college-age daughter. She just finished her freshman year. There's a bunch of other things that, the ebb and flow of life and such. Right. And so I'm always frustrated because I never can get enough time in. And it's never about, I don't feel like it or I'm not inspired or whatever. It's by the time I have a chance. And I'm not one of these people who could burn the minute. My wife is like that. She'll go to bed 3 o'clock in the morning because she's a graphic designer, as she likes to say. She's a graphic designer by day and a surface designer by night. Graphic design pays the bill. Surface designer gives her pleasure.
Yeah.
And I can't do that. Actually, I just did a dosha thing, for Ayur Veda, 4,000-year-old Indian medical philosophy, I guess you'd want to call it.
Yeah.
And comes to find out when I go to bed and when I rise are in perfect harmony with who I am. So that's
nice.
Yeah, that's all great and good. But now I'm saying, okay, well, when I used to be an abstract painter, I used to be able to bang off these things. Like when I would get session time, I would just bang them off. Not because it was haphazard, but because the work that I did was meaningless. It was just exercise. It was just composition.
Yeah.
Which I always get a lot of pushback from women, especially. But anyway, the point of the story is I've got a gallery and I'm saying, okay, I've really got to crank it up. I've got to get some stuff to the gallery because, I can't be one note Johnny.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden it hit me. There was one particular painting that I did in a series that everybody seems to gravitate to, and that's the painting. And this is a figurative painting. It took me 8 minutes to do. And I remember why I remembered why it took me 8 minutes, because I was like, well, I'm just going to start it and I'm going to leave because I've got to get to someplace. And all of a sudden it was like, oh my God, I can't touch it. I'm done. I got to leave it alone. And that, and again, so the point being, one more try is I'm walking, minding my own business, not even thinking about anything. And all of a sudden it was like, well, you always are deadline oriented. So give yourself a deadline of 10 canvases that you're going to dash off as quickly as you did that 8-minute one. And let's let it rip, see what happens. What are you going to lose?
Right. That's one of the things with short stories that I like writing for anthologies.
Yes.
Well, there where they'll say, we want this type of story, and guidelines can be very strict or very loose, but there's a deadline. And it just helps you focus because you got to get it done by that point.
Exactly.
Versus just writing a magazine that, they're open year round, so there's no rush on this particular story.
Yeah. But, the worst thing for me about short stories is the really good ones, they're too short. I want more, But I guess it's always better leaving them wanting more.
Yeah.
Right. What there's two types of favorites for an author or an artist. Your particular favorite that either A, didn't make it as far as you thought it would, and there's a lot of other sidetracks on that too, or one that you thought, and that's the one that really paid some bills. Based on that, what kind of experiences have you had that way?
With short stories in particular, the editors are trying to assemble a magazine that will appeal to their subscribers, or they're trying to assemble an anthology that will appeal to the people that they are marketing to. So you're really filling a hole. So if you think of it as the editor publisher has an apple cart, so everyone is coming to them with their apples. So you bring your Macintosh apple, and they look and they see, we've already got Macintosh apples. Thanks, doesn't suit our needs at this time. And then you come back with a Gala apple, and they say, oh, we don't have any Gala apples. This is great. So you're always trying to figure out what it is they're looking for and sort of matching that. And then sometimes you just really want to create a kiwi, and you end up creating this great kiwi. You know they're not going to buy it. And you think, well, I want to create this kiwi. At some point, maybe someone will open up a kiwi cart, or, a citrus cart, or something that you can, find a place for this thing to go out into the world.
Mm-hmm.
So there are stories that I may not have really cared for all that much, but it was the Macintosh apple they were looking for. And there have been certainly a lot of kiwis that this is what I wanted to create, and there's nobody yet that's interested in selling kiwis. And sometimes, someone opens up a cart and now they are looking for kiwis. So you go through when you see the calls for stuff, you say, well, what do I have that would fit that? Although I tend to just want to write something new because I love the writing more than going through what's, sitting on the hard drive, figuring out what could fit.
Yeah, I mean, somebody once told me something. The choice sometimes comes down to doing something that fills the soul or fills the wallet.
Yeah.
And more often than not, it's filling the soul. And which brings me to one of the things that my wife posed to me once about, she's a graphic designer. And even when we were in undergraduate school, we knew that graphic designers were not like painters. It's a completely different world. Yeah, it's hard to describe. And the way they're trained is so totally different from the way we're trained, visually.
Right.
So, I was going on and on and on about I've got to sell more work, blah, 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 this, that, and the other. And she said, well, you have to come to the realization that you have to make a choice. Do you want to be supported by your paintings, or do you want to be sustained by them? And I said, well, can I have both? And she said, no, absolutely not. When she says no, absolutely not, she means no, absolutely not. So how about you when it comes down to being sustained by your writing versus being supported by your writing? Have you chosen a path?
No, I still I'm living in the fantasy world that eventually this will support me. It's very interesting, the whole sustain versus support, because I can see that quite clearly. I don't know that I would agree that you can't have them both, because I think some people are lucky enough to have that. Because there are so many people that, at least in the writing world, will produce something and everybody rejects it. It's rare that you send something out and it sells to the first agent, and then the agent sells it to the first editor. You collect rejections. It's just the system. And you just keep doing that until it reaches someone who says, well, I think I know how I can place this to find readers. And that is where you get any of the innovative work and the unique voices, because that person was pursuing the sustain part for years, and then they were lucky enough to find someone who found a way that it could also be supportive to them.
Within the same year that my wife asked me that question, and I couldn't answer it because it was like a sword of Damocles. No matter which edge I touched, I was going to get cut, right? So I'm in a Detroit Fine Arts Breakfast Club Zoom meeting during the pandemic, and there's this woman who's either around my age or older, and she just starts speaking about the exact same thing, about being sustained by her work versus being supported by her work. And she said, you know, the moment I decided to embrace being sustained by my work versus being supported by it, she said, I can't explain it, but that's when everything started clicking.
I think what happens, I mean, I don't know, of course, if it happened there, but when you focus on the supported by, there's a stench of desperation. And I think that flavors what you do. It flavors how you approach things. It flavors how you respond to the setbacks. I mean, I submitted stuff for 20 years before I sold my first story. And I would have continued writing and submitting forever, even if nothing ever sold. And I can really see the whole concept of like relaxing into allowing yourself to live in that art, which just makes it more art-like than just product that you're trying to sell because you think, it's bringing money in the door. Yeah.
I mean, Ernst Gombrich, who wrote The Story of Art, he only passed away a couple of years ago in his late 90s. Still, for me, as a former art history instructor, wrote the best book on art history, The Story of Art. He also wrote one called Art and Illusion. And in Art and Illusion, he said that there was something called the beholder's share. That regardless of your intent when you produce a piece of art, what the beholder gets out of it is what it is. So have you written a story with a specific intent and readers have read it, and now they're defining your characters, the ones you created, the ones you gave birth to, they're describing them slightly different from the way that you wrote them.
Yeah, I've always looked forward to the day when things were turned into other medium, either film or television, just to have that experience of seeing how someone else reimagines it. Another thing on the beholder thing, I was at a writer's conference, 40 years ago. And one of the exercises that one of the instructors did was she would put up, here's a painting, go with it. Here's a painting, go with it. And that was the first time I recognized how I could be inspired by art or not. And when I explained to her the difference between how I reacted to different parts, I said that some of the ones that I couldn't work with were, to me, static. And the ones that I could work with, it's of course a static image, but somehow the artist implied the second before and the second after. And once I had that sense of motion, I could fill in the blanks and create a story based on that art.
Mm.
So there's just ones I respond to that way, because there's, even when they're very, like, someone I quote unquote work with a lot, Edward Hopper. I mean, they're static images, and that's sometimes his point, that the people are like frozen in space in that reality. But I get some sense of motion from, I guess, their thoughts, what they're thinking while they're not moving, because they're trapped in that landscape. That gives me enough energy that I want to tell their story.
I understand that.
What's
the temperature in the room? What's, you can smell the cigarette smoke. Is there a radio playing in the background?
The Delaware Art Museum put out a call at one point. They wanted people to write stories based on artworks in their collection. And then they had a website set up. Here are the 200 works of art you can choose from. Mm-hmm. And like, some moved me and some didn't. And I ended up writing, well, I don't remember what I wrote, but I ended up selling them 2 pieces, one based on a sculpture of a bird and one based on a Hopper painting. No, it was not a Hopper painting. It was a painting called Two Clowns. I forget who did it. And then they contacted me later and asked if I wanted to be at the opening, and I could stand next to one of the works and actually read the story while people were going through the galleries. And while I was there, I was standing across from a Hopper painting. And I had written a story based on that painting already. But all I had seen was a reproduction of it. And seeing the artwork in person, it gave me a different story.
Yeah, that I totally understand. I remember last year going to the MFA in Boston to see the Turner show. It's a big show.
Yeah. And
I wanted to see one particular painting. And there is a definite, it's the weirdest thing in the world. I mean, nothing has changed. There's a space around the image, obviously, you can see it in situ, in an environment.
Right.
But for some reason, maybe it's the scale of the piece. Maybe your brain wants to know, okay, is this bigger than a bread box, kind of thing. It makes a big difference. On the horizon, what are some of the goals that you've set for yourself as a writer? Other than, like a big payday, because we all want one of those to wipe out bills and stuff, right?
I still have not mastered the novel. I've written a dozen, but they never have gained any traction in the marketplace. But that is sort of, the end all and be all of writing. I always want to just write more, work with characters I haven't worked with before. I would love to somehow, writing is either very solitary, which is, when you're writing novels or short stories or poems, or it's more collaborative, such as writing for television, where there's a writer's room and you're working together as a team. So I've not had that experience. And I think it would be interesting. I was at a conference where 2 New York Times bestselling authors, one of them has worked in television and the other one has not. And the one that worked in television was telling people, what it's like. And the other one, he kept going, you mean they can tell you can't follow this idea or examine this character? And he goes, well, yeah, it's a team sport. You're working together. And just the one that had not worked in television, he just couldn't grasp the idea that people could tell him what he couldn't do with the story. And I think that would be a healthy and growth-focused working in that collaborative thing, which I just haven't done enough of.
Yeah, I think, getting out of the comfort zones. I mean, that's
Yeah.
like one of the first things at a lot of these seminars or workshops you go to. They try to pull you out of that comfort zone, and get you to a state that you don't normally, get into. The idea of producing something that it was Toni Morrison who, my God, that woman was a phenomenal writer.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes you're reading and part of your brain's going, where the hell is she going with this? She's got her own particular style. So you've really got to follow because she doesn't really articulate who's speaking. You have to pay attention as you're reading, And I think it was in the documentary that they did on her before her death called Pieces of Me, or the Pieces I Am, whatever. She said one of the things that she's bothered by is that some of her characters won't stay away. They keep coming back and she doesn't want them. They're like ghosts. She keeps trying to shove them back in the closet, and they just keep, hey, pay attention to me. What's the matter? Well, you used me up, throw me out. What's going on? So it's got to be an interesting kind of a thing where when you do create these characters that are so powerful, so meaningful, that you've actually breathed life into them and they become ghosts. Have you ever heard that or felt that?
Yeah, there are characters and stories that I've written, 20, 30 years ago that they keep coming back and I keep thinking about them. And sometimes I'll say, whatever happened with that story? And if I'm lucky, I find out that the story didn't sell. So now I get to spend time in that world again, trying to get it, life. It's always a little disappointing when I see, that story sold. So unless I can maybe some kind of sequel, I'm not going to spend any more time with that person.
Yeah. Even if you change the name to protect the innocent, like the old Dragnet television series used to do. Of all the things that you've written, have you ever written anything that's based on reality, or based on facts and events or whatever that almost became investigative? And even though, how do I phrase this? In other words, it stimulated you so much that you just dove completely into the thing. And even though you may, although you may not have stuck to the reality of the event, you've created or extended that reality. Does that make sense to you?
Well, I don't know exactly. There have been, I wrote a novel and I don't know, maybe a dozen short stories that have taken place on the Eastern Front of World War II. So those were based on sort of reality, although they took a life on of their own. There was one time I was setting a piece of flash, I think it's 500 words, in Baltimore. And I don't know how many dozens of hours I spent researching everything. But it's almost a horror fantasy story. So the details helped me ground that reality so that then I could, take it elsewhere. Did either of those sort of answer your question?
Well, yeah. I mean, it's the creative process is it's almost impossible to nail it down because as you were speaking, and then I was thinking about what my next question would be like. Okay, have you ever had the intent that you were going to do A, and you ended up at K? It's like it's just like hey, wait, what are you doing? What are you doing? And it's just going in that direction because the creative process, sometimes it's almost a hands-off thing.
Yeah, I had that experience not too long ago. See, actually, I'll go back to the support sustain thing.
Mm-hmm.
If I write a straight PI story, there's a better chance I can sell it than if I write a PI story that goes off in some fantastical but very interesting to me way. I was taking the train out of Providence. I'd never been at that train station before.
It sounds like the beginning of the first page, the first paragraph.
Yeah, it was just, I walk into the train station. It's like one room. And I just start snapping pictures. I'm like, I know I'm going to set something here. And it's a round room with a domed roof, and the benches are in a circle. And I decided I was going to have a PI going through that station. He's taking the train back to South Coast. Well, he was going to go to Boston and then get back to the South Coast. And I was excited about having all the things were filling in what the case was going to be all about. But those darn circular benches created this thematic imagery of circles and circling around, and the idea that everything just keeps rotating and going back to the beginning. So he's stuck on a train where, you're on a track, you're going from point A to point B, and then everything that happens on the train keeps going back to that circular concept. And it becomes more about him exploring his childhood. I mean, it stopped being a straight PI story that I could easily sell. And it became more of a existential exploration. And then that became physicalized by them announcing that the train was arriving in Providence, which is where he left from. Mm-hmm. And it works as a story. I really enjoy this story. I love the story. It does so many things that I think fiction should be doing. But it's not that supportive story that I could then turn around and, it could sell to maybe this place, or this place, and start that cycle. Instead, it'll be one of those things that I may never sell. And every so often I'll see a call and say, is this close enough to that? Because, I want to let the story out there.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there's no sense of keeping them. It's just like with painters. Yeah. I mean, there's no sense of keeping all the stuff in racks and shelves, never see the light of day. Or as the greatest danger with painters, especially as we age, is that if we don't make plans before we transition to that next plane, we're going to leave our friends and family with, as a friend of mine would say, either the materials for a bonfire or a dumpster. And there's so many people coming online, so to speak, that way, or going offline, and their work coming, and I'm sure there's writers, have notebooks and manuscripts. And
speaking of Neil Gaiman, he did a blog post or whatever, and he was saying, if you read like nothing else about being an artist, this is the one you have to pay attention to. And he was talking about the fact that, okay, chances are you don't have a will, but even if you have a will, you have to have a literary will with someone with the power to know what to do with the stuff that you haven't sold yet, to know what to do with the stuff where you get the rights back after a certain amount of time, because this is, money for your, relatives going forward.
Yeah.
And there are people that don't, they die and they just, like, they're erased from existence. Whereas there was all that, well, now we call it intellectual property that could have been, creating a living for other people.
Yeah, I somebody asked me that question. It was a lawyer, actually, because I guess more of this is happening. It was maybe 10 years ago. It's funny, as you get older, time seems compressed, like 10 years is like yesterday. And but there was some guy who was in a thrift store somewhere in California, minding his own business, just looking for stuff, and found this book. It was like more of a scrapbook albums. I guess in today's jargon, it's an art journal. And he opens it up and had this incredible, fantastical gouache paintings and drawings and stuff. And it just stopped him in his tracks. And, he bought the thing for like pennies, so to speak. And now he was so intrigued, he starts to do research on this guy. And this is a man who devoted almost his entire life to whatever this subject matter or genre was that he had applied himself to. And if he hadn't have walked into that thrift shop and found that book, he would have been dead. Not like in A Princess Bride, with Billy Crystal's character says about Iago Montoya. Is it? I am Iago Montoya. Yeah, I think that's yeah. He says he's dead, not mostly dead, not And in doing this artist index thing, part of it that has been difficult to do is to get people to talk about their friends, relatives, acquaintances who have passed on, and give them a chance to resurrect them, or in some cases, as there's been situations, and I can understand. If somebody is in hospice care, you've got other things to worry about at that point in time. But you've got givers of life. In fact, I believe that's the Egyptian word for sculpture. A sculptor is giver of life.
Huh.
Yeah, which is a really interesting concept. So when you put your characters out there, it's kind of weird, comparative to a painting, I think, that they can outlive you.
When I was in high school, I read a short story, and it stuck with me until today. And well, it will stick with me in the future. I finally found that short story in a collection at the library. The book was published in 1969. Chances are it was a reprint, so it was probably written, well, it was probably first published in the mid-60s. It was written, obviously before then. but it has influenced me in my life for 45 years. And that is what art can do. It colors and gives a perspective to our life from outside us. And it doesn't matter when that art was created. We can still be moved by something that was created, hundreds of years, thousands of years ago. And every so often you hear people talk about, that the artist has lived on. It's like, no, but the art has. And the art is still influencing and having an effect.
Yeah.
Which is why it's so necessary and important.
I'm trying to remember the name of the author now. At first, it was like one of those nights where you're flicking through Netflix or whatever, and and I'm the type that even like when I used to smoke, I wasn't brand loyal. I would just, the first thing that came into my range of vision would be like, yeah, okay, fine. It was almost like a roulette. In fact, what got me to quit smoking was this really great commercial that they had, that they created a cigarette machine to be almost like a game of chance. And when you pull the lever, and then the cigarette would fall down into that tray, and then the catch word of the commercial would be "you lose." But it's called The Night Train to Lisbon, the movie, and it starred Jeremy Irons, and I was fascinated by it because he's, a very stuffy academic in Basel, Switzerland, teaching in a private school, and this woman, a Portuguese woman who had attempted suicide. He's walking on his way to school, to teach, and he sees her attempting suicide. He stops her. They're both, it's raining, it's dripping wet. He drags her into the classroom. The kids are like, what the heck is going on here? And all of a sudden he's bitten by the mystery of this woman. And he's never ever done anything impulsively. And he tries to find this woman. And he goes to a bookseller before he takes off. And he finds this book called Os Livros das Palavras, the Goldsmith of Words. And now he's totally bitten, and he goes to Portugal, to Lisbon, and the story starts to unfold there. But the wonderful thing about this particular novel was that the main character is this would have been author who he wanted to be a philosopher and author, but his parents forced him to go into medicine because that was a greater accomplishment.
Yeah.
And he continued to write, and after his untimely death, his sister published this book that this Jeremy Irons character got a hold of. And when the novel came out, it was so realistic that people really wanted to know, did this guy actually live? And there were even quotes from the book within the book.
Yeah.
And I guess that's really what you want, right? I mean, it is about immortality, isn't it? In some odd way.
I would see it more heightened life. Obviously, I don't know what I'm saying. For me, with the writing, see, there's the writing experience and there's the reading experience.
Mm-hmm.
For me, with the writing experience is when I get into the flow of that character and their story, and that is more real than reality, my own reality.
Okay.
Well, I guess reading is that too.
Mm. The name of the author is Pascal Mercier, who wrote that. And one final thing, because wow, the time has flown by. Wow. Yeah, I'm really intrigued by this. I saw this on one of those reels on Instagram. You're scrolling and boom, something catches your eye, and obviously that's the whole thing of Instagram. Yeah. But abracadabra, which we all abracadabra. An incantation that mostly was by hack magicians and stuff. It's actually Hebraic. It's a Hebrew term, and abra means I will create, and cadabra is as I speak, and that's really like buried in my head. I'm really intrigued by that. I will create as I speak. You're writing that down, right?
I am.
Yeah.
I'm working on a story now where it's actually about a mob enforcer, but it starts with him taking his daughter through the alphabet. And then when he's actually dealing with someone, he's trying to get them to pay back their loan, he all of a sudden goes on this side thing about the alphabet. And I've had no title. It drives me crazy when I don't have a title. It's so much easier when I have a title from the very beginning. Yeah. Because I can name the files.
Right.
And all my notes refer to it. So it's always a struggle when I don't have a working title. But that would work as a working title.
Yeah, good. I'm glad I can help. Any final thoughts before we leave? That's my last question before I wrap it up.
Thanks for doing this. I think there's a real loss when people lose touch with the art of the past, because there's so much that can be gained from it. I was always intrigued / horrified by the monks that would do these elaborate sand art things and then destroy them. That's one of the things I couldn't get my head around. There's lessons there for me still to learn.
Well, I had an art instructor, my undergraduate painting instructor, who was a Quaker. And because he was a Quaker, he was allowed to be a conscientious objector during World War II. That didn't mean he would not be conscripted. They made him a medic, a non-combatant. His unit cleaned out 2 of the worst death camps in Germany and or Poland, like on the border. Right. And I had asked him what the worst part of the experience was, and he said, I realized after 9 days I hadn't vomited, and that made me vomit. And he became a Buddhist, or became or embraced Buddhist principles and such.
Yeah.
So as an instructor, it was really interesting. I remember once he went on the 6 Persimmons, a painting done by the monk Mugi. His name was Mugi. And I thought my brain was going to explode. It wasn't until years later, and I love this instructor, but that's one thing. Like, he just went on, and all of a sudden, I had this cathartic moment. Like, oh my God! And I had to go find that painting, by that monk. But one of the things that Herb Cummings used to say from the very first day of class, because he was also our freshman foundation instructor, he'd let us go on for like 2 hours, the first drawing we ever did in an academic setting, officially. And then he just set us up to this point where he wanted us to rip our drawings in half. And, he could see the look on their face. And he said, I want you to know right now that it's all perspiration. That's all it is. It's perspiration. Yeah. It's the perspiration of your cerebral labor. And that stayed with me all this time.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'll let you go so you can do some more brain sweating. Steve, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
And with that in mind, folks, we wrap up another podcast with writer Stephen with a PH, D. Rogers. And thank you so much. And we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
We'll see you next week for another episode of the South Coast Artist Index podcast. To learn more about the South Coast Artist Index, visit theartistindex.com. Find us on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube.